Columnist at the New Republic, Natalie Shure, has recently reported on symptoms of long COVID. Last month, she published an article saying that we might have gotten long COVID all wrong.
She poses the following: some post-COVID symptoms may be produced by the brain, but does that make them any less real? Columnist at the New Republic, Natalie Shure, joins us now to discuss her article. Welcome, Natalie.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I read the article, and I really enjoyed it. It's very thorough, very long, very nuanced, very well reported. And then it was getting a lot of blowback I saw from people on social media who are very all about long COVID and how debilitating it is, et cetera. But you're not arguing, and I want to give you a minute here to kind of summarize what your findings are and what your thesis is. But you're not saying long COVID doesn't exist, but you're saying that kind of the way we're talking about it isn't quite matching the reality of what data is revealing. So why don't you explain that at greater length?
Sure. I think that there are a whole lot of people who are very debilitated and very ill, and that's an awful thing, and my heart goes out to people who are experiencing these symptoms. I think that long COVID is a phrase that describes a lot of different things that are probably different disease processes at play. Some of them are just lasting symptoms from severe illness. We know that that is the case, that is something that happens. I think that other symptoms are in all likelihood driven by psychosocial distress, which isn't a patient's choice. It's not something that they're doing on purpose. And it's actually one of the hardest problems in medicine to solve. We know this from other illnesses that are driven largely by psychosocial distress, things like depression, things like addiction. I think that there are better models for looking at what's going on and looking at what might be the best way to treat these patients.
Yeah, in your article, you do such a great job of discussing this in terms of sort of hardware versus software problems. And I was thinking a lot about fibromyalgia, for example, which is kind of one of these software problems where somebody is experiencing true distress, but it's more manifesting in the brain and, like you say, psychosocial distress. So walk us through what the difference would be in terms of a medical and a public policy approach to responding to something if it is psychosocial software rather than physical, let's say, somatic hardware.
Sure. So the software hardware analogy is something that people who study functional disorders really use to try to explain it. Functional disorders, I opened my piece with a woman who has something called functional neurological disorder. For a long time, this woman couldn't walk. She was incredibly debilitated. She at one point lived in a nursing home believing that she was going to die before she got diagnosed with functional neurological disorder from a supportive clinician and was able to, with the help of different rehabilitative exercises, to basically become somewhat better. I think that something that's driven by psychosocial distress means that perhaps the best way or the best shot that they have of getting better, and this is very difficult even with best case scenario, is adjusting some of the context of their life. And that's why one of the things that I really end with is that I think that reducing the amount of suffering in the world through redistribution, through universal health care, things of that nature, is probably going to do the most to reduce suffering on a broad scale.
Right, and the reason, what you're saying and you're describing here doesn't really sound controversial at all, but there is a community of people really pushing to get angry when you say things like that, because they're saying, no, this is, lingering complications of the actual sort of respiratory disease, right, of the actual conditions causing brain fog and pain and anxiety and being tired all the time. And you're not saying if you're experiencing those things, if your brain is telling you to experience those things, it is real because we don't experience anything outside our brain. But if you look at the evidence and you look at the data, it's much harder to draw direct correlation between necessarily the disease component of the disease itself. Given that I know that some of the people, who say they're suffering from long COVID, or at least early on in the pandemic, now virtually everyone's had it, but at least early on, then they looked and those people had never actually had COVID, which makes you say, so there has to be a component of it at least that could be the trauma of what we've all gone through, or of watching loved ones die, or, of losing a job, or what economic stresses, all those things. Again, not saying it's not real, but it's just not the way a lot of the kind of long COVID zealous people are describing it.
I think that that's true. I think overall, what you're saying, I think is mostly correct, and it means that there is unlikely to be a biopharmaceutical cure for long COVID. There's never going to be something that looks like penicillin for brain fog. This is a symptom that's incredibly debilitating. It affects a lot of people, not just in long COVID and other illnesses too, including illnesses that, things like cancer. People have debilitating brain fog, and medicine has struggled to solve these problems. We do have a few tools, but I just don't think they're going to come from the pharmaceutical industry.
And we have, examples. Take Havana Syndrome. I think we interviewed you about that on the show, which is not saying people's pain is not real. People are experiencing something in their brain that is distressing them, but we can't find any evidence, for any of the claims about for the various, a psionic weapon or whatever it was that could be causing it. There's no evidence of any of that. Not saying it's not real. It's just not described by like a literal thing.
Yeah, I think that Havana Syndrome showed us that it's very easy to understand how someone could ascribe very real suffering to something that's not the proximal cause of that suffering. I think that, in the case of Havana Syndrome, it was a lot more serious of a problem. I think that their narrative that there was a hostile foreign actor chasing Americans around the world and shooting them with ray guns, I think that nipping that narrative and being very emphatic about why that narrative is wrong is more important. It's more damaging. But I think that, the way that the long COVID narrative is emerging is empowering quacks, is maybe stopping people from getting better and turning people away from solutions, especially on a broader level. So I think that the narratives are doing different things, but I do think that they are similar in the respect that these are sick people, these are people who are ill, and I think that they're not grasping a story that best explains why that is.
Well, on that front, last week, Washington Post technology columnist Taylor Lorenz retweeted this: "The eugenic undertone surrounding COVID policy has really shocked me. It has challenged my views of us as a society. Public health policy now based on survival of the fittest. Those who don't make it are dismissed as dry kindling. I really thought we were better than that." And I saw along the similar vein calls for your article to be retracted or corrected or something. This is coming from people who I'll see they'll describe in their Twitter bios that the long COVID sufferer, it's like becoming an aspect of one's personality for some people, in a way that does not seem healthy to me, frankly, and it is almost like doubling down on this being a permanent condition of the disease that I think would, if it's more along the lines of what you're talking about, seems if anything it would just reinforce it.
Yeah, I can't blame anyone on an individual level for, what they're grasping for. Again, these are people who are suffering severely, who in a lot of cases don't have a lot of power, and I think they're finding solace in this identity. But I do think in general, accusations of eugenics aside, I do think that, building a better society, having more social support for people to be able to take time off, to be able to recover from whatever illness it is that they do have, I think would make society look a lot better. And I do wish that there were more distributive policies, more social programs that would come out of this pandemic, and that I would rather be talking about those than some of the minutia that are advanced by these camps.
Real quick before we wrap, Natalie, is there any data about who gets long COVID? Is this something, are women more prone to it? Are certain kinds of people, do we have any data about who it is primarily being afflicted by this, or is it evenly distributed?
Well, so that's a difficult question to answer for a few reasons. For one thing, a lot of the data that we do have is about anyone who has lingering symptoms let's say 12 weeks after their initial infection. And that's going to include some of the people with, this classic type of long COVID that has been centered in the media narrative, people with, post-exertional malaise and fatigue and brain fog. That will include people like that, but it will also include someone who is on a ventilator for 5 weeks and is now having some difficulty breathing afterwards. So those are typically different types of patients. That there's not a lot of commonality between them. I think for the most part, especially when you get to more than 12 weeks out, when you have the more prolonged illness that is marked by fatigue and brain fog, it tends to be more women than men. It's hard to say where they're getting the research cohort. I think that we have a lot of research in general that shows us that poor people who suffer oppression, people who have more difficult lives, more difficult jobs, certainly have more, chronic pain, chronic fatigue, and they might not necessarily identify as being long COVID or ME/CFS patients. So it's murky, but in general, I think that oppression and poverty drives illness, and that rates are higher among those people.
Fascinating stuff. Natalie, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll have more Rising right after this. Stay tuned.